I think I will let my talk introduce me, but let me just say that I've worked for over 20 years in the Altai Mountains of Russia and Mongolia. I am Professor Emeritus from the University of Oregon, and I have a considerable background in studies of Mongolia, Central Asia, and China. So maybe I'll let you ask me questions afterwards and we'll see how we go, okay? This map of Asia with our study region located by the red box will help you get spatially oriented. Mongolia sits like a great clam between Russian Siberia to the north and China to the south. We first entered the Mongolian Altai in 1994. We were a small team, including Russian and Mongolian colleagues, and my husband, Gary, as a project photographer. We had been working in the Russian Altai just across the international border, recording rock art concentrations as well as surface archaeology. We reasoned that moving our survey to Northwest Mongolia, to a region that was essentially unexplored archaeologically, might offer us new and interesting challenges. Our purpose was to identify and record hitherto unknown rock art complexes. And since almost no researchers had worked in Northwestern Mongolia, we figured that our project could be fruitful. As you will see, what we found in that unknown land was nothing short of mind-boggling. That project lasted 10 years, but it morphed into another one, the Mongolian Altai Mapping Project, involving myself, my geographer, colleague James Meacham, and Gary. In this project, we focused on the identification and mapping of surface archaeology, as well as rock art within a region of approximately 22,000 square kilometers. The map I show you here was basically all we had when we got started. Other than rivers, some routes, and a few settlements, there is virtually no information about either the topography or antiquities. The process of enlarging and giving accurate detail to this map was a challenge, which Jim and I addressed together from the very beginning of our work in 1994. Actually, we began that while I was still working in the Russian Altai. These maps will give you some idea of what we were able to accomplish over those 15 years in Mongolia. The map on the left clarifies the relationship of our study area to the Altai Republic of Russia, which is, let me see if I can get this thing to work here. No, sorry. No, sorry. No, how do I get out of this? No.
Try clicking on your slide down below, see if that does it.
This is such a, no. Okay, I will have to go out and come back in again, I think, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, let me do that. And show. Okay. Okay, so here we are back at the maps. The map on the left clarifies the relationship of our study region to the Altai Republic of Russia in the upper left and to northern China in the lower left. The map also indicates the topographic and cultural results of our mapping project, with all the red dots that you see there indicating monument concentrations, including rock art and surface archaeology. The map on the right indicates the locations of the major rock art complexes we identified and documented, and they include Araltalgoy in the lower part, Sagangol, Bagoygor, and then Hayama. You can see that they are all located within the high mountain boundary region on the east side of the ridge, separating Mongolia from China. I'd like to get a laser. Yeah. Okay, so here you can see over here, this is Araltalgoy, Sagangol, Bagoygor and Hayam. And you can see their relationship to the high mountain ridge. Based on the results of both of these projects, the Mongolian government proposed a World Heritage nomination, Petroglyphic Complexes of the Mongolian Altai. This was accepted in 2010, and presently a second nomination, Highlands of the Mongolian Altai, is under consideration. Let me now turn to the rock art itself, first giving you a sense of topography and of the paleo environment in which fauna and human society depends. This landscape has truly been shaped by glacial action. The peaks dividing Mongolia, Russia, and China are still crowned by major glaciers. These give rise to rivers whitened in glacial silt. Over the millennia, the glaciers have shaped the distinctive aspect of this region, its massive moraines and its stark hills. In the upper elevations, where our rock art complexes are located, the bedrock reflects the passage of glaciers, their studied advance and retreat in the gouging and polishing of the surfaces. And here you see it very well in this beautiful image where the surface has been scraped and polished and gouged by the glaciers. I will be referring here in this talk to the rock art of three complexes, Bago-Oygor, Sagangol, and Araltalgoy. The Bago-Oygor complex covers the south and east facing slopes of two conjoined rivers, extending for a distance of approximately 20 kilometers. Time and the elements have exposed the rocky bones of the hills, leaving large surfaces that are often covered with text imagery. When we began to explore this complex, we only knew that a Mongolian researcher had left notes in a previous year that he had seen rock art imagery on the slopes above Tsagan-Sala, right about this area here. We started there, expecting to find a small concentration, but over that and succeeding seasons, as we continued to trace our way down the river, we found that the complex was huge, extending down the Tsagan-Sala and up the south-facing slopes of Bago-Oygor. You might get some sense of the size of this complex by this image, where we draped our locational points over the whole landscape. So you can see the whole landscape here of Bago-Oygor with the dots, and each dot represents a concentration of rock art. Having trouble getting this thing to work here. Sorry, this is not very. The upper Sagangol complex is even longer, covering slopes and valley outcrops over a distance of 25 kilometers east to west. In the upper right, you see the valley plowed out by glaciers that come down from the mountains to the west. That valley is a highway of outcrops decorated with pecked imagery. To give you a sense of the density of this material, the large outcrop you see in the lower right is covered with about 740 individual images. The view here is east down the Sagangol River. The rock art at Araltalgoy is concentrated on the bedrock of a small hill at the far western end of the two Great Lakes. This hill has the largest concentration of open age Paleolithic imagery in North Asia. However, as you can see in the lower right, the bedrock surface is deeply crushed and eroded, often to the point of disintegration. The view here is to the east, to Hotonor, which is one of the Great Lakes. And it's the largest lake in this part of Mongolia, actually. The forests you see in these slides are all that are left of the great Holocene forests that once covered this region. The rock art of these complexes spans a history of approximately 12,000 years. The earliest images refer to the late Pleistocene, early Holocene, or in cultural terms, the late Paleolithic, early Mesolithic. Beginning about 8,000 years ago, however, the cultural stage went dark at least in the higher elevations. Only early Bronze Age, about 4,000 years ago, do the signs of human expressive activity begin to reappear on the bedrock and boulders of our valleys. This activity lasted through the Bronze and into the early Iron Age before disappearing again before the end of the first millennium BCE. Thereafter, rock art of succeeding centuries is virtually unidentifiable until the Turkic period, when it had a brief resurgence. To understand these curious starts and stops in the rock art record, one must consider the region's paleoenvironment. At the end of the last glacial maximum and persisting until about 11,000 years before the present, the region was characterized by cold steppe with a xeric vegetation that supported such megafauna as mammoths and rhinoceros, as well as aurochs, horses, and ostriches. With the beginning of the early Holocene, about 10,000 years before the present, tree growth and increasingly mesic vegetation coincided with the disappearance of megafauna. Aurochs, horses, and elk inhabited the steppe and forest borderlands, and argali and ibex dominated the slopes above the tree line. During the Middle Holocene, human activity at the higher elevations seems to have been blocked by forests of spruce, larch, and pine, expanding up the mountain slopes, as well as by rising lake levels as the glaciers melted. Scientists date the onset of the late Holocene to about 4,500 years before the present. That is 3,000 years before the present. 4,500. By that time, forests were retreating, dry steppe was expanding, and lake levels falling. It is generally agreed that by about 3,000 years ago, the region was already characterized by present-day vegetation. Now, why isn't this going? In our study region, the earliest material is dated to the late Paleolithic. The images are all of profile figures, static, often massive in body, and executed in contours using blunt, direct pecking with a heavy stone. That execution technique is quite visible in the case of the rhinoceros in the upper right, or in the unfinished aurochs in the lower left. The elk in the upper left measures about 1 meter in length. It is also, like the rhino and the unidentified animal in the lower right, demonstrate another aspect of this early art, the reduction of the legs to almost vestigial points. These early images are both highly realistic and at the same time static, as if frozen into what was understood to be a specific expression of being. And let me particularly call your attention to the wonderful deep pecking here on the rhinoceros and on the beautiful auroch, which was unfinished and was pecked into a beautifully polished surface. The imagery of the Paleolithic Mesolithic transition is also executed in profile with directly pecked contours. These images include the earliest representations of hunters, sometimes brandishing what looks like a club of some kind. In the upper right, a single profile figure holding with such a stick approaches a group of elk, aurochs, and horses, the very animals that would have inhabited the interface between steppe and receding forest. And I'd like to get these pictures out of the way because I can't point to something here. The whole panel evokes the sense of a hunter approaching his would-be prey on the surrounding steppe. On the spit boulder in the lower right, a frontal figure, also with a weapon of some kind, is paired with a large moose. The scene on the left is more difficult to decipher. 2 ostriches, each requiring a different perspective on the part of the viewer, recognizable by their long necks and large bodies. And let me just point this out. So here is the large body of one, here's the long neck, here's a long neck and head, and the large body of another. And then there are 2 horses. This one's upside down, and this one is right side up. And in the very center, we see the figure of a man, frontal man, very awkward. As clumsy as these scenes may be, and as this particular scene may be, it serves as a beginning point of what will become a major narrative tradition. The joining of humans and animals shifts attention from the singularity of a beast to its interaction with the human world. I mentioned that over what would have been the middle Holocene, the rock art record in our valleys is essentially blank. During this period, heavy forests and high water levels, as well as erratically receding and advancing glaciers, must have discouraged any hunters from moving into the higher elevations. However, when we get into the late Holocene, about 4,000 years before the present, we see the beginning of a 1,000-year burst of created energy. Of course, there were significant cultural and stylistic changes over that period, but we can generalize about several distinctive characteristics of rock art in the Bronze Age. Animals include auroch, elk, wild horses, caprids, and occasionally bears. They are always presented in silhouette rather than in contours. And the pecking is now clearly indirect. That is, the artist would hold a pecking instrument in one hand and a hammerstone in the other. In this way, the images reflect the outlines done with clarity and control, a density of pecking, and often a marked refinement of form. Most importantly, Bronze Age animals are almost always represented in action, leaping, walking, or just flying across the rock surface. The large rock face in the upper left, covered with superb images of wild horses, rises just behind a clear spring. The placement of that panel there evokes the sense of a real world where animals would gather at the water source. The contrast between imagery of the Paleolithic period and that of the Bronze Age can be seen here. Above on your screen, we have auroch. That on the right is executed with rough, direct, and deep blows. And simplified into a massive profile figure. That on the left is elegantly done, executed with indirect pecking, and is beautifully vital. Below, we see the same contrast in the case of two caprids, in that on the right, the coarsely pecked contours are barely visible against the lichen-covered stone. In the left, the caprid is a perfect expression of alert vitality, elegant, dense pecking, and clean contours. The controlled checking of the Bronze Age artists is often fascinating. Let me give you two examples here. I found the small figure on the right in a vertical crevice. In executing the figure, the artist has clearly delineated his large bow, as well as his long quiver affixed to his waist. If you look carefully, you can see the feathered ends of arrows right here, protruding from his quiver, and a kind of attached flag. This long wand-like element hanging from his waist and terminating something like a foxtail was a Bronze Age version of something we still see with hunters today used to mesmerize their small prey. On the left is a detail from a much larger scene, but the artist has given us two levels of observation: horses, stags, several boars, and walking birds. Horses, stags, there are boars here, and there are a number of wonderful walking birds here. Hold us to the earth, but the extended wings of large birds, perhaps cinereous vultures or lammergeier, make it seem that we are looking up or down from a great height. In this way, the artist effectively creates a three-dimensional world. On rare occasions, Bronze Age artists engraved the imagery. The artist who did this scene of combat was probably inspired by the smooth and polished surface with its elegant glacial scrape. These figures are difficult to see, but it is possible to make out their long composite bows. You see this very clearly here. Their long quivers. And the fact that there's a variety in the patterning of their clothing. Here's one There's another one over here, and yet another one looks like almost a fur-covered suit. In this way, the artist effectively, or the artist gave us a varied group of figures. Hunting scenes became a constant theme in the Bronze Age, and in them we can begin to pick out the material indicators of chronology. In this detail, taken from a boulder literally covered with fleeing animals, two archers hold large composite bows of a size that would have been impossible to manipulate from the back of a galloping horse. This fact allows us to date the imagery no later than 3,500 years before the present. Such details then help us to consider the dating of the style in which the animals are executed. So they become a kind of a benchmark for me as I go through the rock art and I look at the styling of the figures, and I can compare it then to panels that can be dated more precisely by virtue of the weaponry. In another panel from the same period, a knot of hunters surrounds what looks like a small bear. So here's the bear in the center, and here are the figures all the way around. In addition to a few long bows, there's a long bow, a long composite bow here. Some of the figures hold clubs, others hold spears. Poor bear doesn't have much hope, does he? And this is another probably bow. The varied postures of the hunters suggest the circling of hunters around their prey in real space and time. Here, as in all Bronze Age hunting scenes, it is noteworthy that animals are never represented as bloodied or dead. A frequent motif in Bronze Age hunting scenes are representations of what appear to be mythic animals, that is, animals that are far larger than they could ever be in real life. This panel from Sagangol is admittedly difficult to see, but it represents a huge yak attacked by at least 4 diminutive hunters. And here you see the yak up here, and his great horns, his large body, his large tail. And there are 4 hunters. The clearest one is at the front. You see the detail over here. He is accompanied by a dog and thrusts a spear into the animal's chest. The bull is beautifully pecked, and the variegated patina of the stone indicates the shifting mineral content of the surface, or of the matrix, I should say. In imagery from the Bronze Age, we do see representations of combat, but they are relatively few. The scene in the upper left suggests a duel with spears, although not a very serious one, it seems. On the right, small figures appear to be facing off with bows. The scene in the lower left is much more dramatic. A family caravan, scented by a large yak and carrying the basket with 5 children in it, has been attacked by a group of archers. The flight of the arrows is indicated by long streamers flying back and forth. The scene suggests a drama in which a traveling family has infringed on hunting grounds claimed by others. Here, however, as in the case of hunting scenes, we see no images of death, no dead animals, and no fallen humans. And that is a absolutely standard rule in the Bronze Age art. This last scene brings me to one of the most important cultural shifts in the Bronze Age. As the forest retreated up the slopes and lake levels fell, small bands of people began to go up into the mountains, first for hunting and foraging, and later with their herds of animals. But moving households required portable dwellings and animals to carry the materials and children of the family. Thus, we see yaks heavily laden with the materials of the family, or we see yaks laden with or carrying the children of the family. And in some cases, yaks that are carrying the makeup of the composition of the yurt itself. These and many similar panels indicate that by the mid-Bronze Age, we can observe signs of the emergence of portable dwellings that we call variously ger or yurts. And these structures have lasted up to the present, and they're carried in a similar manner today, as you see here. But now in the Altai, the beast of burden is more frequently a Bactrian camel rather than a yak. To judge from rock art of the Altai Mountains, the opening of high pastures must have encouraged the advent of herders by the mid-Bronze Age. The animals are almost always horses, yaks, or cattle. Curiously, even though they were certainly herding small animals by then, sheep and goats, those are rarely represented. And let me call your attention to the scene up here, where a frontal herder is herding a group of horses along what looks like a trail. And what's interesting to me is that these horses are not a modern gracile type, but actually look like the old Przewalski horse, the wild horse that existed in this area up until maybe 1,000 years ago. And on the right, the lower right, I just want you to note the wonderful rendition of the large yak that is being led by a man, and the way in which the artist really suggests the heavy body, the heavy feet of this massive animal. In one remarkable panel from the Uyghur complex, we the scene of a family preparing to caravan. In the right center, a man appears to be directing the process. You see him here. And up above here, there's a woman holding the leads to these animals. And the animals include heavily loaded yaks and horses, which are oftentimes attached by leads from their noses. Within this same scene, you also see wild animals, argarli, for example, or ibex and argarli, as well as an occasional boar. Now, that doesn't mean that they were all together in the same place, but it does suggest that there was a physical interconnection between the domesticated and the wild worlds that we don't see anymore. That panel brings me to one of the most interesting aspects of Bronze Age rock art, the wealth of what I call narrative scenes, often involving many images arranged across a whole boulder or outcrop. The scenes at first appear to be snapshots of life without any unifying theme. In fact, many of these panels reflect several motifs underlying the worldview of the Bronze Age hunters. These include the understanding of the interconnectedness of human and animal life, and the concept of the wild world as the source of life, essential to family existence. These scenes also reflect how at the same time, there was a conviction that anything taken in the hunt had to be replenished. And the agent of that replenishing was understood to be the mistress of the mountain, represented either as a female figure or as an elk. These themes are reflected in this panel from the Uyghur complex from the Bronze Age, in which a hunter seeks his prey among a large group of wild yaks. Curiously, beside him, you see this here in the detail over here, it stands a small woman, identified by her long gown and her long hair. She is not, however, simply a friendly, casual bystander or a female partner. Such a person would have no place within a hunt. She must rather be read as the mistress of the mountain, the source by which the animals taken by the hunter will be replenished. There is one other element here that introduces a note of danger. In the upper section, and here you see it in the detail here, is a strange, large figure, a kind of giant. Such figures recur in other panels, suggesting a darker side to the basic motif of the scene. I have some ideas what it means, but it's too complicated to go into right here, but they definitely have meaning. Some of this complexity can be seen in another large boulder, also from the Uyghur complex, and you can see the size of this boulder in the upper right. Most of the imagery revolves around a hunter within a mass of wild animals. And here is the hunter, and here are all the wild animals. In the upper left, however, is a curious grouping, a group of stags juxtaposed with three female figures, 1, 2, 3, all in the position of birthing, giving birth. The implication here is that the women and the elk are the source by which the wild world will be replenished in order to support the hunter and his family. These motifs are more poetically reflected in the tangled imagery on another large boulder from this complex. Here again, the surface is covered with wild animals, elk, orc, caprids, and wolves, conjuring a world of rich animal life. Among the animals can be seen at least 4 hunters. You see one, let's see, here's one, and here's another one. There's another one up here somewhere, and then there's a very nice hunter right here taking aim at the orc. The animals and the hunters exist in a landscape defined by tendrils that seem to describe paths across the mountain or sections within such a land. But if you follow those tendrils down to their source, you can see that they emerge from the head of a small elk. Can you follow this? As if that animal's antlers had grown into the landscape itself. To the left of this elk stands a loaded yak, symbolic of the family and its well-being. To me, this scene is another way of reflecting the conviction that the wild animals must be replenished, and the source of that replenishing is, here at least, seen in the elk itself, a sign of the regenerating female. I should add, however, that at the very top of this scene, where the stone has been bleached out, there is another large, giant figure who actually carries a sword. In the late Bronze Age, we begin to see images of horse riding, as well as representations of its cultural corollary, the development of short, recurved bows that could be used on horseback. This bow type is clearly visible in the image on the lower left, in the hand of the striding hunter. In the detail on the lower right, by contrast, you see a figure carrying a bow that was shorter than the long composite bow of the full Bronze Age, but is not yet the shape and size of a true recurve bow. In the upper images, you can see how the recurve bow would be fitted into a new kind of quiver carried on horseback, and would be much more convenient than the long bows. Well, the only ways that carry the bow and the quiver and the arrows on the horseback here. And here you can see over here another bow sticking out of the quiver. For more reasons than I can discuss here, horse riding and this seemingly small advance in weaponry effectively revolutionized the steppe world and had a profound impact on rock art. In fact, those changes indicated by a new bow type are echoed in other aspects of rock art in the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. Increasingly, the representations of animals conveyed not the natural world in the wild, but stylized creatures, seemingly more reflective of carved or cast objects. This is plainly visible in the way the artist of the beautiful elk images below on your left has shaped the musculature and hips of the animals in a manner reminiscent of the cast bronze pole top animal above. And in the image on the lower right, the animal, was a strange combination of elk and moose, seems closely copied after a model that lies behind the gold crown element above. There was, by the full onset of the Iron Age in the mid-first millennium BCE, this tendency towards stylization became pronounced. Stag and caprid images became mannered, even awkward, and scenes of predation reflected a ferocity not seen in earlier Bronze Age imagery. And you can see that here, the stags, although they're beautifully pecked, they are kind of so denatured, like some kind of a long crocodile creature. And down here, these stag has become positively wolf-like in its appearance. In my opinion, these changes signaled the end of the great age of tradition of Altai rock art. There was, however, a brief resurgence of pictorial energy in the Turkic period, when we see large panels of hunters, wild animals, and combat scenes. But this scene was short-lived and came to an end in the 8th century, when the Turks were replaced first by the Uyghurs and then by the Kyrgyz. One last note. Many of you are probably wondering, where are the shamans? Well, I'm afraid that there are no shamans, at least none in rock art of before the Iron Age. If we think of the Siberian shaman as a figure with a large drum, as this figure here is, and a steed such as a stag or a horse, then the only images we can identify as a shaman are all from the modern period. And this particular one is probably done the 19th or 20th century. Before closing, I want to acknowledge the many institutions in this country and in Mongolia and in Russia, which help to support our multi-year projects. I also want to recall the several individuals in Mongolia who were of great assistance to us over the years. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in more in exploring this great rock art tradition further, let me recommend several book-length publications. One is the Atlas Archaeology and Landscape in the Mongolian Altai, published in 2010. Second is the Hunter, the Stag, and the Mother of Animals, published in 2015. Third is The Life of Two Valleys in the Bronze Age, published in 2019. And there is also the Mongolian Altai Inventory Collection, which is open to anybody to use without cost, and which has several thousand images of rock art and service monuments from this region. And finally, just as a point of information, if any of you are interested in what it was like to work and to live in this very rugged part of the world, I have a book coming out as we speak, Journey into Other Worlds, which details, it's really a memoir of my coming to Mongolia, my work in Mongolia, and the people we knew there. So with that, I will say thank you and turn it back over to my hosts.
Boy, thank you very much, Esther. If everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did, they are really reeling from all this great rock art.
That's great. Now I've got to get back to you. I'm having trouble doing that.
Yeah, just unshare screen and you'll be fine.
Unshare screen. Okay. Let's see. I don't want to. Okay, I don't want. Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat and we can relay them to Esther.
To come and eat here.
I think, yeah. I did have one question regarding, you said there was a long period when the Altai wasn't occupied.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether you know where the people went at that time and whether those people left rock art in a different spot.
They were not there. There were no people there. The Altai was not inhabited probably until the beginning of the Bronze Age. It was too cold, too raw. The people didn't have any way of living there productively. In the Paleolithic period, the small bands of people moved up the valleys and the river valleys and settled along the rivers, but they disappeared by the beginning of the Holocene. So there was nobody there as far as we can tell. If they did rock art, it's nowhere to be seen in Mongolia.
Really? So basically people moved out of Mongolia altogether at that point?
There weren't many people. I think we're looking at a very, very thin population, and a population that probably came down when they first came into the Altai. They came down from the north, from the Cyan region, following the opening up of high pastures and hunting grounds. I think that's what happened.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so we had a remark about your photography, which says it is superb, but they seem solely focused on representational images. So this person is curious what percentage of the total number of images are representational, or versus whether you found any geometric or abstract imagery.
No, and here again, this is a very interesting issue. There is none of that kind of geometric imagery, or almost none of it. Occasionally there might be a doodle, but almost none of it. It is representational. It's incredibly representational, and it continues that way for thousands of years.
Yeah,
Now, it's not that I'm ignoring anything, because I actually did look for this sort of thing. I tried to record everything that we saw, but there are none of the marks and signs that people find in other parts of the world, and that seem to suggest on different kinds of mental journeys. There's none of that.
yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, there's always questions left unanswered, right?
Right, right, right.
Okay, so the question maybe related to that: how did you go about dating the panels?
Do you have another 5 hours?
in a
I,
nutshell.
no. I'd say that you look at several things, and in this case, I would really recommend that a person go to my book, The Life of Two Valleys in the Bronze Age. But there are several things. First of all, you have to understand the paleo environment, what the environment would have supported in terms of animals. Okay, so that was my baseline. Then you look at the animals that are represented and the manner in which they are executed. That's a very important distinction there. And then you start to look at things like the style, of course, with which they are represented, the weaponry that's being carried by, because that shift in the late Bronze Age to a recurve bow and to horse riding was of fundamental importance. And that allows us to actually separate out the earlier from the later. And that's very simply, the main ways in which I look. And of course, I working in these complexes where I had thousands and thousands and thousands of imagery, and I was able, because of the work I did with Jim Meacham and Gary, to keep good track of where these images were and what they were. I could start to, you might say, compare, and then you start to see how things work. So it was like a great big detective story.
Yeah, okay. Well, we have some questions related to that detective story.
Okay.
So first of all, obviously you presented some great images, and in most of them, it looked like it was men hunting animals. Is that pretty much representative of what you found, or were there other images that maybe weren't so interesting that maybe had women or other kinds of scenes?
No, there actually are more women in imagery than you would imagine, especially in the Bronze Age. Well, actually, you get birthing women a lot in the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. But and I did show you some images with women, okay? And
Right. Yeah, so definitely birthing. Were they doing other things as well?
sex, for example, yes, it's very interesting. There are a lot of scenes of what we call euphemistically erotic couples. But those erotic couples frequently, they're again a part of this whole underlying motif of the need to replenish the world of animals. They're very frequently in hunting scenes, you will see at the bottom or on the side a copulating couple. And that probably refers to the idea that the hunter must sleep with the mistress of the mountain in order to be sure that the animals will be replenished.
Hmm. Okay, well, that leads almost directly into the next question, which is, how do we know the meaning of these images?
Okay, let me recommend another book of yours. I go into all of this. It's been a very, very long process of detective work, but in The Hunt of the Stag and the Mother of Animals, which says it all right there, I go through this whole process. You have to actually recreate the mentality, the worldviews from which this material comes. And to do that, you have to go to the north, as I said, in present-day Khakassia, and to other parts of North Asia. And And you have used also a lot of ethnography to try to find in materials gathered in the 19th century and earlier by Russian ethnographers, stories that have to do with, or that help to explain some of these things. So what I did is I basically would take apart a scene, like one of those large boulders, let's just say the antler landscape. I take it apart. If I see that kind of a theme repeated elsewhere, then I know I've got a story, right, that can be shared. And this was the case all the time, that a story that seemed to be told on one boulder would reappear in a somewhat different form on another boulder or another surface. And then I start to look at the whole mix of elements, what's been saved in ethnography, and what makes sense. That's all I can say now. It's such a huge process. You know, this I'm trying to recreate in, what is it now, 45 minutes, what took me decades to do.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Actually, we have a lot of questions in terms of connections between the
Okay.
you know, oral traditions and modern, you know, or recent ethnography, which I think you addressed there. But somebody, you know, was curious to ask about those monsters, you know, those large men that you hinted at in your
The
talk.
giants.
The giants, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would like to understand it better. Other scholars have noticed giants appearing in other parts of North Asian rock art. And I cannot say what it is. And I've got another beautiful giant on a beautiful surface, but it's very hard to see. So I didn't bring it today. It must have something to do with a kind of a balance, the other side of this positive regenerative aspect represented by the woman and the elk. It must be the other side that works that way. And I have to say that what I could not show you in these images, and particularly in that beautiful scene of the man hunting the wild yaks with the woman standing beside him. At the top of that boulder is a motif that we find regularly in this rock art, and that is what I call a bird man leading a horse. That to me is a sign actually of death and the journey to the next world.
And is that through ethnography that you get that
Well,
interpretation?
you get that, but you also, when you start to see it again and again and again, you realize that the lammergeiers and the Cinereous vultures live there from the, you know, the dead animals, the dead things. And so I believe that they practice a kind of what's it called? Bury, well, didn't bury, they simply would
Like explanation?
they would lay the body out in the upper cliffs, and the birds and the animals would take off the flesh.
Right.
This comes from ethnography. It comes also from what we know, say, in Tibet, and we know, and what we see in this rock art. And I'd like to point out also there's something very curious, even today in the Altai. Although you find Kazakhs bury their dead, the Oryanghai Mongols do not seem to do that.
Mm. Yeah. Somebody else mentioned the Kazakhs, and I guess sky burial is what
Sky
you were
burial, yes, yeah, right.
Let's see some other questions here. Somebody asked, I guess, talking about alignments. Did you observe any alignments either to sky or between you know, different monuments while you're out?
Okay, again, I recommend the Atlas of Archaeology and Landscape in the Mongolian Altai, plus another book of mine that's coming out right now from Brill on monumental archaeology, where we took the monuments themselves and we looked at them located in space, orientation, view shed, and so forth. And there's always a significant element there.
So the alignment is to view shed, or is it to something in the sky?
Alignment is almost always to view shed to the east is very important orientation, but it's more complex than that, because these monuments, as you can see, if you go to the Atlas, these monuments are large and complex. They can have many altars around them. They have, okay.
Wow.
It's another whole another whole part of the picture.
Yeah, boy, you collected a lot of great information. So somebody asks, someone here who has visited the Bayan Olgi, I don't know
I,
if I'm pronouncing
yeah,
it
buy an Ogie. That's right. Yeah,
okay, including one of the major Sagan gold sites, and that
right.
one included representations of carts as if viewed from above but splayed out to show both sides. Uh,
Right.
are you finding them? Are they pretty common, and what time period did they represent?
Again, that's a topic I decided not to touch because it's so complicated. In one of the images that I showed you, the one with the beautiful lammergeier wings spread out, there is actually a cart seen as if from above. And the cart imagery comes in the late Bronze Age. It is not, they're usually referred to as chariots because they have spoked wheels very often. Sometimes they don't. And I think that while in some cases they may represent carts, I think more often they represent actually the, again, that issue of sky burial, carrying the body to the upper elevations and leaving the body. I think it's a sign of death.
Hmm.
In
Um,
this part, wait, in this part of North Asia. Now, in other parts of North Asia, it is considered to be a sign of of warriors or of a conquering people, but not here.
yeah, given that these tribes were nomadic, presumably, right? They do you find differences like depending upon whether they were at a place at a different season?
Well, first of all, I don't know if I'd call them tribes. There were groups of people, and they seem to have come in from the north or from the west, usually, occasionally from the southwest, and they overlay each other. Um, they all seem to have shared a lifestyle in common, but their differences are reflected in the difference of styles primarily, and weaponry, and the way in which they dressed.
Yes. So you couldn't tell by the rock art whether this was a summer camp or a winter camp area.
No, well, oh yes, you can tell that you could not live up in these areas in the winter. They don't.
Okay, so they'd all be summer then.
They're summer encampments. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Someone asked why the late Bronze Age tradition ended.
Well, as I said, that it's related to a number of things that relate to larger social movements. The the ability of human beings to get up on horses and to ride and control them was a very important part of the shift, cultural shift in the late Bronze Age. It allowed people to then herd larger groups of animals, but it also coincided with a time when there was the increasing desiccation of the environment. So we have the impression that people actually were getting up on horses and moving elsewhere in Asia. You've probably heard of the Scythians. The Scythians came out of the Altai Cyan region, and about the beginning of the first millennium BC, they began to move west, probably in search of better pasture.
Yeah, are there archaeological or cultural deposits at these near these panels?
There are sometimes you can find them. This is a landscape that's extremely deflated. Okay. So there has been very little serious archaeological investigation. There have been excavations of some burial sites, but and we know what we know, but it's nothing terribly revealing. You don't have good indications of settlement sites, except possibly in the Paleolithic period, where you actually can find scatter in certain areas along the rivers. But it's all on the surface.
Yeah, I mean it's so interesting. Here's a comment that you've got the signs of the journey into another world here. That this person notes that they can also be seen in Greek pottery and in rock art panels like in Valcamonica, the faith in another
Right,
life.
right, right.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you can't take them sort of at face value, right? There's
Right.
always
It
a
look right.
metaphoric
It's a
interpretation.
metaphor. Yeah. It's if you look at the Altai rock art just like that, you think, boy, how matter of fact these people were. It is what it is. But in fact, when you start to know it and you look at it more and more, you realize it's very richly metaphoric.
Yeah, and a lot of these metaphors seem to cross cultures, right? Go.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. Right.
A question: how long was your normal working season?
Working season could last 6 weeks was the time that where the weather allowed us to work up there. Problem was that in July, when we might have started, it was frequently extremely buggy, very unpleasant. And in August, the snow starts. So our best working season was always late July through till, say, early September.
Wow. Well, yeah, people are thanking you for sharing your research. There are a lot of people would be interested in knowing whether you would be willing to share your email.
I would, but something, I don't want to be inundated. I would like very much to correspond with people if they have some basic questions, but I would really urge them. Let me just say, Peter, I would like to urge them to, they might get a lot of their questions answered by looking at this book of mine that's coming out right now, Journey into Other Worlds. I think they would find a lot of their questions about what was it like? How do you get there? What was it like? What was it like to work there? What were the people like? They're all answered in that book.
Yeah, great. What's the title again, and when is it coming out?
It's coming out like as we speak. It should be
Okay.
up on Amazon this next week, I hope. It's called Journey into Other Worlds.
Wow, sounds great. And
And Peter, it's full of photographs by my husband, so it's worth looking at.
yeah, well, fantastic. I mean, I can tell by the comments that everybody was just thrilled with what they saw. You really introduced us to a whole nother world, which was fascinating to see.
Well, I'm very glad to have done that, and I'm delighted for people to get a sense that how varied world rock art is. You cannot homogenize it into one pattern. It changes everywhere. So I'm glad that this has been of interest to some people.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic to see stuff from this part of the world. So thank you very much for that. And to everybody who joined us, thank you as well. If you would like to learn more about ARARA, please check out our website and our Facebook pages. We invite everybody to renew or join our membership if you haven't done that yet, and support the study and conservation of rock art.